Picture a Neanderthal having the worst luck in recorded history. Blind in one eye, deaf in both ears, missing most of his right arm, amputated above the elbow by a stone hand axe and probably a lot of nerve. By every nature is brutal rule we were taught in school, this guy should not have made it past breakfast. Instead, he lived into his 40s, which in Stone Age terms is basically retiring to Florida. Now picture a kid in a limestone cave in Borneo, 31,000 years ago, who had his lower leg removed with a sharpened rock. No anesthesia and no antibiotics, in a rainforest where a paper cut can turn deadly by Tuesday. He did not just survive the operation, he lived another 6 to 9 years afterward. And picture a 6-month-old baby with Down syndrome, buried 6,000 years ago inside one of Ireland's most sacred stone tombs, the same kind of tomb usually reserved for chiefs and tribal elites. None of these three people should have made it, according to almost everything pop culture has taught us about prehistoric life. All three of them should be a one-line tragedy in a nature documentary, right before the narrator says something grim about survival of the fittest. Instead, they are proof that humans have been going to ridiculous, exhausting lengths to keep disabled people alive since before we invented the wheel. In one case, before our own species had even finished evolving into its current form. So why do so many of us still picture cavemen abandoning anyone who could not pull their weight? The answer involves one guy, one book, and a cliff that archaeologists eventually went and dug up themselves. And what they found underneath that cliff is so much weirder than the version you got in 7th grade. You already know this one, even if you cannot place it. Ancient Sparta, a newborn gets inspected by a council of elders. If the baby is not perfect, soldiers carry it to the edge of a chasm on Mount Taygetus called the Apothete and throw it in. Cheerful opening chapter for a parenting handbook. It shows up in documentaries. It shows up in the movie 300. It is the go-to example whenever someone wants to argue that caring about disabled people is some soft modern invention and that out in real nature, the weak just do not make it. Here is the issue. There is exactly one ancient source for this entire story. 1. A writer named Plutarch describing a king named Lycurgus who might not have even been a real person, more of a legendary founder figure, basically the Greek answer to King Arthur. Plutarch wrote this down roughly 600 years after Lycurgus supposedly lived. 600 years, that is the historical equivalent of trusting a viral tweet about what George Washington whispered to his horse. But that is not even the best part. Archaeologists actually found the Apothete, the real pit on the real mountain, and they dug it up. They found bodies, 46 of them, every single one between 18 and 35 years old. Not one infant skeleton, 0. Researchers who spent years analyzing those remains all landed on the same conclusion. This was not a baby disposal site. It was where Sparta dumped grown men, criminals, traitors, prisoners of war. The most famous proof of systematic infant exposure in all of human history is not backed by a single tiny bone, in the one location where we would expect to find thousands of them. So the most famous example of ancient cruelty toward the disabled turns out to be a 600-year-old rumor about a possibly fictional king, contradicted by the actual crime scene sitting underneath it. And this myth never just sat around being harmlessly wrong. Adolf Hitler specifically praised Sparta's supposed habit of destroying sick, weak, and deformed children, in his own writing, calling it more humane than modern medicine that kept disabled people alive. A legend built on almost nothing became a talking point used to help justify one of history's worst atrocities. So if the myth is fake, what is the real story? Let's go back to that Neanderthal. In the research, he is known as Shanidar I. Somewhere around 50,000 years ago, he took a devastating blow to the head, crushing his eye socket and almost certainly blinding him on that side. His right arm was amputated at the elbow. His leg was injured badly enough to leave him with a serious limp for the rest of his life. Later analysis of his skull even found bony growths sealing up his ear canals, meaning he was likely profoundly deaf as well. A blind, deaf, one-armed man with a limp, hunting and gathering his way through an Ice Age world full of cave lions and hyenas, with no modern medicine and no way to hear any of them coming. He lived to somewhere between 35 and 45 years old. For a Neanderthal, that is elderly. Basically the Paleolithic version of throwing yourself a surprise 90th birthday party. And that does not happen by accident. Someone fed him on the days he could not hunt, Someone walked slower on the move so he could keep pace. Someone watched his back specifically because he could not hear danger coming on his own. For years, possibly decades, a man who, by every survival of the fittest rule people love quoting at parties, should have died young, and instead outlived plenty of able-bodied members of his own group. If watching a childhood myth get dismantled by actual archaeology is your kind of fun, go ahead and hit subscribe now because the receipts only get better from here. But that Neanderthal story is nothing compared to what happened in a remote limestone cave in Borneo called Liang Tabo, 31,000 years ago. Someone, probably a child at the time, had the lower third of one leg amputated. Cleanly, surgically, with a sharpened stone blade. This is the earliest confirmed deliberate amputation in the entire human story. Full stop. There was no anesthesia and no antibiotics in a tropical environment where infections kill fast and quietly. And the bone shows years of healing afterward. This person did not just survive the operation, they lived another 6 to 9 years, which means somebody changed dressings, kept a wound clean, and physically supported a child who could not run, in the middle of a rainforest for most of a decade. And then there is the baby, a 6-month-old boy buried in Ireland's Pulnabrone tomb around 6,000 years ago. DNA pulled from a tiny bone deep inside his inner ear showed 3 copies of chromosome 21, Down syndrome. He was not set aside or hidden away. He was buried inside a megalithic stone monument, the kind of structure an entire community builds together by hand and reserves for its most significant dead. Here is the actual pattern once you stop trusting the movie version of history. Across 50,000 years, across 3 completely different continents, totally unrelated groups of humans kept making the exact same choice. They carried the people who could not keep up on their own, not occasionally, as some weird outlier. Over and over, in the hardest survival conditions imaginable, with absolutely none of the safety nets we have now. The myth told us compassion was the fragile, recent thing, some soft, modern habit that real ancient humans supposedly never wasted resources on. The bones say the exact opposite. Caring for the most vulnerable person in the group is not something civilization invented somewhere along the way. It might be one of the oldest things our species has ever done, and the cruelty everyone assumes was the default setting. That part is the legend. If a 600-year-old rumor about one cliff could end up fueling an actual genocide centuries later, it is probably worth asking what other obviously true piece of ancient history nobody ever bothered to check. Subscribe if you want to find out.